Allora, buonasera a tutte e a tutti e benvenuti al secondo appuntamento di quest'anno con i seminari di RiVe. Io oggi sono qui soltanto per un brevissimo saluto perché lascio il mio posto alla professoressa Bragagnolo, che è coorganizzatrice di questo ciclo di seminari e che vi presenterà l'ospite Valérie Hayaert, nonché l'intervento che oggi andremo a sentire. Posso solo anticiparvi che sono molto curiosa e molto felice per due ragioni. Intanto perché abbiamo di nuovo uno sconfinamento disciplinare che, come ci siamo dette lungamente proprio in queste ore, è sempre, come dire, foriero di percorsi e prospettive completamente inattese. E poi perché un po' egoisticamente questo tema, illustrato appunto da una storica del diritto, che però insomma lavora sulle immagini da moltissimo tempo, è un tema che mi è molto caro perché, come forse qualcuno di voi ricorderà, Leonardo Corona, che è un pittore che i miei studenti conoscono molto bene, a cui ho dedicato vari studi, ha dipinto un intero ciclo della Passione per la scuola della Buona Morte di Venezia, che è la scuola di Santa Maria e San Gerolamo alla Giustizia in volgo dei Picai. E quindi sono molto contenta, egoisticamente molto così ho davvero voglia di ascoltare quello che ci dirà Valérie, ma vi lascio alle cure di Manuela Bragagnolo che vi presenterà l'ospite del seminario. Grazie.
Grazie Valentina e sì, buonasera a tutti quanti. Io sono ovviamente felicissima di essere qui ancora di nuovo e sono contenta di essere qui con voi in questo contesto bellissimo dei seminari di RiVe e sono felicissima di essere qui oggi perché ho il piacere di introdurvi una studiosa straordinaria che è appunto Valérie Hayaert e che ci parlerà oggi e che è veramente un'interlocutrice d'eccezione sul tema dei seminari di quest'anno, che è appunto quello della forma e della norma nella cultura figurativa del lungo Rinascimento veneziano. Allora, Valérie è una classicista e una storica, però direi che queste sono definizioni un po' riduttive perché davvero si è occupata di moltissimo, con una profondità incredibile e ha una formazione appunto anche straordinaria e attualmente insegna alla Law School dell'Università di Warwick nel Regno Unito. Nelle sue moltissime ricerche, se appunto cercate un suo curriculum online vedrete che ha pubblicato moltissimo, si è occupata di molti temi della cultura umanistica europea della prima età moderna, con un'attenzione speciale e ancora una volta con un'ampiezza e una profondità di sguardo straordinarie della dimensione visiva e delle immagini del diritto e nel diritto e della giustizia. Quindi davvero questo è un campo di eccezione in cui Valérie è assolutamente un'esperta. E ha, come vi dicevo, pubblicato moltissimo e il suo interesse particolare inizialmente, ma continua a lavorare su questo, si è rivolto alla mens emblematica e quindi all'invenzione da parte di avvocati e giuristi umanisti di immagini, di raffigurazioni xilografiche di temi giuridici e teologici nella tradizione della serietà ludica o del serio ludere. Nel 2006 ha ricevuto il premio alunni dell'Istituto Universitario Europeo per la migliore tesi interdisciplinare e il suo libro bellissimo, se avete occasione di vederlo, appunto trovatelo, leggetelo, Mens emblematica e Humanisme juridique, è stato pubblicato da Dro nel 2008. I suoi lavori successivi hanno riguardato, tra le altre cose, l'estetica della giustizia nei tribunali dalla prima età moderna a oggi e dal 2014 al 2018 è stata co-redattrice della rivista emblematica An Interdisciplinary Journal for Emblem Studies. Quindi anche qui cominciate a vedere come davvero Valérie si muova tra vari territori e vari ambiti del sapere. Ha lavorato tra gli altri con Peter Goodrich, con cui ha pubblicato ed è coeditor di alcuni lavori fondamentali sul diritto come cultura ed è coautrice con il giudice francese Antoine Garapin di un libro intitolato Allégorie de la justice. E nel frattempo ha anche tradotto, è anche traduttrice di un libro interessantissimo di Ian MacLean dedicato all'interpretazione e al significato nel Rinascimento, con particolare riguardo al diritto, e ha anche contribuito a 2 mostre in Belgio sulle immagini della giustizia appunto un'altra intitolata Call for Justice. Finisco ricordando il suo ultimo libro pubblicato nel 2023, Lady Justice, An Anatomy of Allegory, per Edinburgh University Press, che è appunto fresco, uscito l'anno scorso. Ecco, questo per riassumervi ciò di cui appunto la nostra speaker di oggi si è occupata, e oggi il titolo del suo intervento è appunto Tavolette, identificazione martirio, il condannato a morte di fronte alle immagini e al dispositivo dell'immagine consolatoria, e quindi qui io vi lascio a Valérie e la ringrazio ancora per essere qui e vi ringrazio ancora per essere qui.
Grazie Manuela, Valentina per l'invito molto generoso e nella affascinante città di Venezia. Mi scusi di non parlare molto bene l'italiano, quindi se non è un problema farò la presentazione in inglese. For anyone who might struggle with English, I'm very open to send the paper by email. Just ask, and it's going to be a pleasure. Please, if you do want to stop me because there's something you don't get or something that needs more attention, do stop me. I'm fine with that, and I hope that English will be okay. So I'm very thrilled to show you part of those tavolette because I've been able to organize a conference in Tours. So the 2 panels I'll show you are preserved today in the Museum of Fine Arts in Tours. And during that conference I organized during COVID, I was able to not only bring students inside the museum, that was kind of a big struggle, but also get the curators to put the tavolette just behind the speakers. So we had a genuine, we could really see the materiality of the objects. So today I'm not able to show them, obviously, but I have a little video that I've recorded when I was able to unframe those wooden panels. So maybe it will give a sense of the object. So in ancient societies, the ritual of accompanying those condemned to death to the scaffold confronts the central question of evil and the appropriate treatment of evildoers. For the public authorities, it was first a question of warding off the dangers of a revolt that could prove disastrous. So the first objective of the authorities was to control the event, and because it was random and it could be fearsome, it could be problematic. But for Christian confraternities who were to confront the question of sin and redemption by proxy, the problem was very different. God himself has allowed evil to happen, so isn't God responsible to also eliminate evil? So if no one is damned in advance, and if there's good in everyone, those condemned to death must be led to descend into themselves and reflect on the faults they have committed and hope for forgiveness. Hence, the task of the comforters, confortatori, who have to console them, give them courage, and also reconcile them with themselves. So one of the finest tactics that was invented in this strategy of consolation is the use of images. Images of martyrdom. So you can see them. So yeah, the basic question I'm going to ask is that of the link between those wooden panels, the identification of the poor foe to the image of Christ, and the idea of martyrdom. And the idea, very concrete idea, that these wooden panels would serve as visual dying aids. And the question I want to ask you, and I'd love to have your opinion about it, is can a painted image of martyrdom genuinely play a consoling role in the staging of a capital execution? So here you can see that images of martyrdom are used or can be used for judicial purposes, as they create an imaginary bridge between the crime committed here and its possible redemption in the afterlife. And if images of martyrs are so abundant in Western iconography, is it not because the image itself has been thought of as martyrdom? In other words, the image would be thought as a witness. This is an idea that Georges Didier Berman has developed in an exhibition, Table de Montage, about his own library. So the two paintings you see here, so they are attributed to a painter known as Dalmasio or pseudo-Dalmasio. So the dating is approximately 1336. And they are made of poplar wood. They are 34 centimeters high and 24 or 25 centimeters wide. And they were designed to be handled and placed in front of the condemned men's faces until they are mounted at the scaffold and beheaded. But right in their face, like really, you couldn't really see well. You were just in front, the distance was not enough. In medieval times, Christ's crucifixion is often used as a model for performative embodiments of Christ's passion. It is known as the practice of imitatio Christi. Yet, unlike public performances of imitatio Christi, in which human condition is intrinsically bound up with a desire to imitate Christ's life and subsequent fate, tavolette are something really different, because there are mechanisms imposed upon the condemned men's bodies. You have no choice but seeing the image that is imposed in your face. They were used to oppose actively the cause of evil, which has also to be fought in the sensible world. So these objects are quite enigmatic. So we first need to reconstruct the material context in which they were used and the ways in which they formed part of a specific judicial ritual in which the rhetoric of the effective image plays a key role. Paradoxical and chilling though it may be, the study of the manipulation of this image deserves to be part of a wider reflection on the agentivity of images. And here it's an extreme case. I remember when I came with the book Valentina has by Nicolas Terpstra, The Art of Executing Well. And I showed this book to one of the curators in the museum. He was so shocked about even the title. How can you execute well? What does it mean? this is the beauty of the technique of inflicting death. This is quite shocking. Obviously today, because we've abolished the death penalty, this is very different, but we have to think beyond that and before that. So objects are not static or unresponsive. They are interactive, agential, and performative. And to be honest, I'm not sure, the discourse that comforters will have saying that this really plays a consoling role into the performance of the staging of an execution. I'm not sure it's that simple. It's truly ambivalent, and sometimes it doesn't work. And we have cases where condemned, those poor folks, they were just in the middle of a total panic, and they would just collapse, and the whole thing was ruined. So the ritual for assisting the condemned, which has been documented in great detail, required the priests of the Brotherhood to hold up pious images before the eye of the condemned, both to force them not to see what was about to happen to them. It was kind of also not really a blindfold, but something you would put and you would ask the condemned to focus on in order to cut his head. And the other thing is that they were shown iteratively. They were shown at different moments, at the eve of death, during the whole night. So there was a preparation, a long preparation of the condemned. The aim was also to make the condemned person identify with the image of martyrdom, in this case, Christ, you see on the right, but also St. John Baptist on the left here, and St. Catherine of Alexandria on the right. And you will have already noticed very clearly that on the right, this is rather consoling, because at the very last moment, an angel will save the poor Catherine. But on the left side, the beheading is executed well too. So it's a binary image. You can still hope for salvation, but that will happen, you see, and that's very intriguing. This specific field of inquiry is a realm of research blessed with excitingly rich prospects. So first, obviously, this very intriguing, well, that's my bibliography, but this is probably the book that I would recommend to read first. And then Achim Timmerman also refers, it's a very interesting article, he refers to them as what he calls, I quote, narcotic, salvific images. So this is a very interesting ambivalence. And my contribution stems from a fascination with these objects and a question. So how were these images of judicial devotion deployed during the condemned men's final moments? Is it possible to reconstruct how these images were manipulated? What deserves attention is the visual device adopted, the way in which the image as an artifact is brandished in front of the condemned man's eyes, saturating his vision, numbing, this is the idea of a narcotic, numbing his distrust, and persuading him to look away. And this ritual seems to give the officiating comforter a certain latitude in introducing bits of specific hagiographic narratives. So depending on the case at hand, the comforter will tell the narrative of St. Catherine or the other one, the most dramatic one. And it also indicates what was prescribed by manuals. So that has been analyzed by several scholars. But what was prescribed in manuals is only one element of the dramatic dynamic which actually occurred. So my discussion attempts to open up questions about the relation of empathy. So there's a very interesting book about what is the empathy of the executioner, l'empathie du bourreau. What can it be? There must be some distance. It can't be empathy, as we know. And also imagination. This is probably very efficient as a mental image, as Valentina was suggesting, because it provokes the memory of your understanding of another background image. And also it's about what is going to happen to you in the future, redemption or not, the battle with the devil himself. So it performs a hinge function, and the tavoletta seems to ensure the tight closure of the iconic space. And this is really important because we have cases that are well documented when we know that the tool was it was shown, the two faces were shown, but there were also these para-occhi, so what we call the œillères in French, like, you know, for animals. And this is really interesting because that was the way to just to also help the condemned to death not to be spat on, because he was in the process of being, mocked. And I mean, you can imagine that was also a public staging. So the very nature of this object makes permeable the threshold between the interior fictional space of the scene depicted, so crucifixion, martyrdom, and the imagining space of paradise versus hell, which is hinted at by the Christian theology of the cross. And it also, before the beheading as the final moment, it was also an image that was shown to help the powerful in doing a self-compassionate reflection about his own fate, and inviting him not only to identify, because this is maybe the most difficult, but to empathetically merge with the depicted character on the panel. So to address this question, I will first bring back to the fore the ritual of the confortatory friars. And behind that, the question, was it really that effective? Can the effects intended by the friar preachers in such a specific and ephemeral context be put into perspective and understood by taking into account the triangle that is established between the executioner, the friar preacher, and the condemned man? So they have obviously different fields of visions, but also behaviors. And what I would like to stress specifically is what is achieved here is achieved through a visual dimension. The image is not a text, obviously, and its plurivalence allows us to cross these views and to cross also the ways each character will use it. For instance, the condemned man will perhaps kiss the tavoletta, and there will be a different treatment. When you kiss something, you don't see it. Obviously, you just put your lips on the panel. And what I want to reconstruct is this interaction. What does the condemned man see or not see? For instance, Montaigne, in his journal, he will describe this ritual, and insist upon the idea that they can't see, and this is something that is imposed on them. So he really see the trick and the sleight of hand. And finally, what does the audience see? This is a very small image. What does the audience see? What status should be given to this device, which is based on a powerful antithetical image? And we need also to explore the construction of martyrdom, because for the comforters, it was a matter of showing that the word they brandished with this image on painted effigies was indeed the word that awaited the condemned man the minute his head fell off. So this is the idea of, it's also an imaginary image that is a bridge that opens to something else. So once entering a museum collection, there was a little problem, as you saw this neo-Gothic frame, and you probably wonder why is it framed like that. So that's the story of Octave Linet, French painter who was also an art collector, who's just reworked all those paintings and painted them over to turn them into devotional panels to fit his lounge at home. So he completely, that's the 20th century neo-Gothic frame. So you have to forget about it. And I'll show you now this little video that shows, so I was, these are not my hands, but I'm just next to the person. And I've asked them to unframe those tavolette, just to verify first the thickness, and this is the curator, the thickness, those panels were very thin, and you'll see how thin they are. And so these short seconds shows that there's, well, you can't see here, but we were checking whether they were present of open insect galleries, if there were visible hinges, to check whether those panels would have been made of different, with those para-occhi we were looking for. There were none. But the X-rays also revealed gaps, implying that both paintings were kissed and touched. So I will come to that a bit later and talk over the video. So following the work from Jérôme Bachet, it should first be emphasized that these images of justice are both image objects and images places. Image objet, image lieu. That is, images in situation, which must be linked to a specific judicial ritual. So from the late Middle Ages until the end of the 18th century, with some cases happening as late as the 19th century, in some mobile images, so not only tavolette, but also crucifixes, were used to accompany the condemned to the place of execution. So namely, it was in Bologna, other cities in Emilia and northern Italy. And those moving images depict the Passion of Christ or the martyrdom of Christian saints. And they were held, as I said, conspicuously right in front of the convicted faces. So although these images were designed to serve as visual aids, guiding the souls of the unfortunate at the moment of their execution towards the hope of redemption, it is just as plausible that these devices were intended to isolate the condemned man from the vision of his own beheading, taking care not to worry him in the first place, but to prevent him from seeing the weapon with which he was about to perish. So from the outset, the device is highly ambiguous, because although the brother confessor intended to use it for consolatory purposes, it could just as easily be used as a rut, a blindfold, or a device designed to anesthetize the visual perception of the person who is about to die, and to prevent his panic. So here I've chosen an image of Lady Justice, who is trampling one of the reverse pans of the scale at her feet. And you see that instead of holding them in balance, her left arm embraces a downturned executioner's sword, and her right hand holds a tavoletta affixed to a short handle. And this tavoletta is held towards the blade of her sword. And in using the tricks of a misleading image, here this monogramist AC, we don't know who's the author of the engraving, seems to show that Justitia seems to lend herself to a cruel sleight of hands. Achim Timmerman used the expression of a narcotic salvific icon when explaining the function. To him, the function is, I quote, to effectively tie the execution ritual to the salvific fruits of the Passion of Christ. So one thing I want to stress first is that images were rare at the time. And when manipulated in this way, they were intended to convey an image of Christ as obedient in the face of inescapable death. And because of an ostensibly intransigent attitude towards suicide, convicted men should refrain from desperation at all costs. So in the archives, we can read cases where the condemned were the prey of phrenesis, of furor, or the contrary, which would be acedia, when you completely you can't move, and you're. It's also bad for the executioner from a technical point of view. I'm sorry to be. That's a very bad comment, but also melancholy or insanity were also understood as sign of an inferior temper. So the role of the comforter was to excite courage and to show if you think of Catherine of Alexandria, she's a resilient martyr who accepts her fate. So by this obedience to death, the idea was to show that Jesus had accomplished a substitution for all sinners. And in the famous hymn of the Philippians, Christ's death is an example of the reversal of forma servi to forma Dei. So the idea that the underlying discourse, Christian discourse, was to say that Christ lowered himself, becoming obedient to the point of death on a cross. That is why God has exalted him above all else. So this is a quote from Philippians 2:8-9. So in this logic, the infamous legal punishment of the cross is reinterpreted as a sacrifice to the point of staging a triumph over death. And the doctrinal theological point conveyed by the preachers through the crucifixion, through this image, was to convince the sinner that if Jesus was substituting his own flesh, making himself an offering for sin in order to bear the sin of many, and thus bear their iniquities, being able to identify to Christ's suffering was for the condemned man a way to accept the sacrificial and propitiatory visual language of the church tradition. So how does an image which is so gruesome give consolation and hope to sinners? How can the wrongdoer respond to the identification pathway expected from him? And more importantly, can these little mobile panels truly have a redemptive power, embracing both the outcast, the unforgiven, and diving out oppressive feelings and comforting the inconsolable? So one of the ways in which these images are going to be used is exactly that they disclose a powerful symbolism of salvation from sin that sits between ritual, worship, and daily Christian life. So all these contexts help to explain why these panels were effective in this wide symbolic network. And what we need to ask is the fundamental ambiguity of this execution ritual, where object and user meet. And in Mitchell's formula, we need to ask what an object wants us to do when we encounter it. So first, you can imagine that this word tavoletta is intriguing because it often refers to a later example that you know very well, the famous experience attributed to the Florentine architect Brunelleschi, a scientific protocol studied by Hubert Damisch and others. So the tavoletta was held at arm's length and looked through a lens-sized hole in the panel. And this device was invented to offer the spectator of a sensation of spatial immersion. The tavoletta used by Brunelleschi was thus a very precise visual protocol. In the case analyzed here, you have to think that this little panel was also a very short distance representation meant to be seen through also a precise visual protocol. And the pragmatic conditions whereby these images entered the visual horizon of the condemned have remained unaddressed. So I think a comprehensive history of the instrumental gaze should include these visual aids as part of and parcel of the ways in which the eye was culturally instituted on the model of a machine. These crucifixion images appeared to the condemned on those small portable panels or in the form of three-dimensional crucifixes. So we know from the manual and from the archives they were held at eye level. And we know, and I already commented on that, that new types of tavoletta were even invented to reinforce the visual constraint. And they would create this segmental pictorial space specifically intended for the sinner's field of vision. And Hakim Timmermans speaks of a visual diversion, enabling the afflicted person to escape from everything that was outside his visual space. So what we might try to understand first is how on the scaffold you have three different maybe visual spaces and also functional places. First, the friar, who wants to impose the tavoletta on the condemned. So this is rather of imposing a visual constraint. And then you have the pauvre faux, who tries to identify, and this identification remains ambivalent, because obviously for Jesus, of course, death is not the end, because the discourse of faith is tantamount to proclaim that infamous death has a universal salvific meaning. But as for the condemned man, he can hope for little more than to be handed over to a battle of the afterlife, where he will have to fight the devil. And so the question remains, can he really believe that for him, the infamous death reserved for him will have this salvific meaning? This is difficult to tell. So here I thought I would, it's a rather long quote, but I thought I would read it aloud, because it really explains how comforters were asked to inflict this technology of death in a very, very strict and very detailed way. So that's quoted from a translation into Nicolas Terpstra book. So when you are at the block, and he who has to die kneels down to put his head on it, you kneel down as well, using your right knee and keeping the tavoletta in such a way that he always has his eye on it. That is, so he always sees it. And sincerely tell him the following words, quote, "My dearest brother, make yourself strong and steady at this step, and don't have fear, and aim to offer your soul clean and devout to the Creator who gave it to you. And similarly, pay attention to when the executioner lifts the mallet. Make sure that you never move the tavoletta under his, that is to say the criminal's face, until the mallet is close to the chopping block. And make sure that you put your tablet away at the same time as the blow, so that he who has to die does not notice. Because sometimes when the tablet is taken away too soon, he moves his neck and thus suffers many more blows, which makes it very hard on him." End quote. So you see this careful delineation of the right gestures to perform the technological apparatus of punitive justice. And it is centered on the condemned man's field of vision. And you see that in order to kill effectively, the convict needs to adopt some sort of premature anticipation of death before the execution itself. And here, the condemned man falls prey to a type of legal exclusion from within. And the visual protocol of the tavoletta concretely shows his capacity to be killed. So it's also a way to animalize him in a way. And comforters' manuals may be seen as a Christian way to initiate and monitor a ritual process whereby the condemned man is gradually deprived from agency. Under the combined pressure of the judicial officers and the comforters, the sinner metamorphoses into a helpless, empty subject, reduced to bare life, as his head is no longer pars pro toto. In saying that, I want to stress that the comforter will show him part of a body that has been dismembered, and no longer a body, it's an entire right. And isolated by the exclusion mechanism of the tavoletta, his head no longer belongs to him. He no longer has an anatomical relationship to his own field of vision. And it is therefore a body rendered acephalous by this device, and that is offered for sacrifice. So you see that the technique is to oscillate between acute sensation. So sometimes you will be asked to kiss, for instance, the condemned will kiss preferably the perisonium, so the cloth that shows the fragility of Christ, because you have to show the humanity of Christ first. and also diminished sensitivity. The condemned man may also use the tavolette as a way to internalize a psychological ordeal that the death sentence has inflicted upon him. And the painted panel, as you know, was supposed to remain in front of the prisoner's face until the final deliverance of the coup de grâce on the scaffold. And then you would replace, so my hypothesis for these two panels, if they worked as a two-face device, which is possible, with only one handle, is that you show the crucifixion first, and then at the very last moment, you show a consoling image, the image of the Madonna in the mandola that has an inviting gesture that I will show later. So for one of the ways they create an obstinate visual diversion is to show several details. And there's the idea first that, so I already hinted at that, is that those images painted with a gold backdrop had a specific aura. If we bear in mind medieval forms of public social display, we have to imagine that these images resonate very differently with the viewer, and to an incomparably greater degree than what we can imagine today. This is something that Hans Belting has shown persuasively. Icons depicting Christ, or the saints were much more popular because the viewer could concentrate on the face, and especially the eyes of the figure depicted. And Hans Belting has emphasized this role of the anthropology of images that must probe the origin of the image and its link with death in order to advance our understanding of the ways in which we interact symbolically with the image. So they would become more and more meaningful when the beholders would progress and approach the execution site. And they would allow him to the complete incorporation of his experience into an imagined space over his shoulder. So I have already started skimming to explain the binary image. So the idea that it works very well. It's not very well painted, but that's not the problem. The function is to have a binary image where you have on one side despair, on the other side hope. And this is very effective. So the panel is designed to have the beheading of John the Baptist on the left, and as the counterpart, the martyrdom of Catherine of Alexandria. And so you see on the left side, the sinister side, the beheading of Saint John the Baptist is an example of humility, but also passive acceptance. In stark contrast to that of the failed martyrdom of Saint Catherine, who is saved in extremis from the ordeal of the wheel by an angel sent down from heaven. So you have a double polarity, agreed torment, and torment avoided at the last minute, that would visually suggest to the condemned man that he must believe in his salvation until his last breath. And according to the hagiographic account of by Jacques de Voragine, it is Saint Catherine of Alexandria is the epitome of heroic steadfastness. And one of the factors in the promotion of saints such as Catherine, known as virgin martyrs, that their lives, and in particular their torture and execution, were told in a very macabre way, with cruelties elaborated to an extraordinary degree. So the scene depicted here shows how an angel broke the spiked wheel by which she was to be killed. and you see the instrument that has shattered into pieces. So another detail of her hagiography mentions that during her martyrdom, while the spectators wept with pity, Catherine stood with her eyes raised to heaven without showing a single sign of suffering and fear. And after firmly confessing her fidelity to Christ, she herself laid her head on the block under the executioner's sword. So in short, she defeated her. She defeated her executioners by, and it's a funny example, by exhausting their patience. She was so she would put her hand on the block that in the end they didn't kill her. So sorry, I should have showed you this image. And one of the last points I wanted to maybe discuss with you was the handling of a tavoletta that is meant to be kissed and touched. So it is important, as I said, that we know that criminals were prepared by a long night's vigil during the instrument of the tavoletta was repeatedly shown to them. And in the eyes of the consoler, the tavoletta with their gory close-up of the wounds of Christ or the holy martyrs became an indispensable tool for a fairly sophisticated type of catharsis. So to bring about a conversion in the sinner's souls, they would use tactile sensations, and opportunity for contact had to be multiplied. So touching, kissing, an object that they would probably never had seen or touched before, a precious object. And the martyrdom depicted on the tavoletta through the image of redemptive blood prefigured the blood of the criminal about to spill. So there's one thing that I will just summarize because I don't want to talk too much. It's the idea of blood. And in Latin, there are two words to say blood, sanguis and cruor. And this polarity is very important because cruor is the black blood, the blood that is definitive blood and the blood that is spilled. Whereas sanguis is what you see at the feet of Christ is a river that flows and that will announce eternal life, So this polarity between two types, or the twofold meaning of blood being as well cruor and sanguis, was a helpful tool to focus on a detail. So it's not only, it's also, blood means also life, afterlife. And that was an important thing. So my point in stressing the piety of blood is something that was made by Caroline Binum. And she explained that more than a theological argument articulated by the verb or the practice of conversion, the display of this ambivalent blood was the sensitive climax, raw to the point of intoxication of the ritual killing ceremony. So maybe we can discuss about that later. So the feet and wounds of Christ were kissed by the afflitto just before execution. And if we leave aside the numerous repaints by the owner of the picture in the 20th century, I just mentioned Octave Linné. So now you have, you can see the images restored. And we've removed all the repaints because all this blood you couldn't see before because it was repainted to look more decorous and a little, and you couldn't understand anything. So maybe one last thing, because that was my point. So I hinted at that detail here. You see a close-up of the perisonium. And so we were able with the curator to evidence there are lacuna there. So that shows that repeatedly they would be asked to kiss this specific part of Christ's body. And maybe last picture is, we'll maybe come back to that, but this is the Virgin, you can see a Virgin's gesture of consolation. And also it shows here very visually the practice of what we call amende honorable. So those two condemned are kneeling, and they have already confessed their crimes. They have a rope around their neck, which is not very visible on this painting, but believe me, it's the typical posture of amende honorable. And they are covered in the black tunic that they will later be obliged to wear on their way to the place of execution. So the two figures of kneeling penitents function as a mise en abîme of the real scene happening to them. So the entry into death is also an entry into the visual prison of the image. So if we take a very light example, this morning I went to San Zaccaria and I saw Bellini's angel, musician angel, introducing you as a scopic delegate into the conversation sacrée, the sacra conversation. That would be the very gory equivalent of letting the poor condemned get inside the image, because he sees himself, he's kneeling with his black tunic, and he can see a mise en abîme of his own fate in this picture. So in conclusion, I'd like to suggest a line of inquiry and ask a question. So first, the role played by images from the perspective of cognitive science in general, and the emerging field of neuroaesthetics in particular. So we now know that there's no such thing as abstract perception. We know, for instance, that if you want to force someone to act, to kill, you can use, and that's what the Nazi did, you can use images that you show repeatedly to. So each apprehension of an image object can therefore be understood as a ritual practice involving perception as well as action and interaction. Empathy and sympathy are examples of how we can adopt a value shift, revealing a point of view to which we may previously have been insensitive. And this approach is essential to understand the public staging of capital punishment, as it can shed light on the way in which the repetitive display of an image can annihilate our ability to react. And the last observation, it leads us to a wider questions. As we have seen, these ritual objects are deeply rooted in a Christian context. In order to impose on the condemned man the Christian idea that he should hope for a good death, which implied the obligation to ask forgiveness and atone for his past criminal acts. And that is why the comforters insisted on the image of the patience and compassion exercised by Christ himself, and also by the Christian martyrs. So the rationale was to say these saints had been so severely punished, but at the same time, they were perfectly innocent. So these Christian images, although very expressive and impressive, contain a binary message. So punishment versus either salvation, either hope. And these tavolette are based on the Christian soteriological theory that atonement and sacrifice lead to redemption. To our modern eyes, the visual paradigm of Christ's death as a figure of atoning sacrifice, especially if it is seen as penal substitution, seems to make God wrathful and also engineer innocent suffering, and encouraging poor foes to imitate this paradigmatic sacrifice by submitting to it. And this is obviously a problem of interpretation. That's why the conflict of interpretation are these artifacts true consoling aids or nothing but powerful diversions to inflict the technology of death, that's why this conflict remains alive. And lastly, and I promise I'm done, I've tried to introduce you to this way of dealing with the materiality of image, because I think history of academic art is often based on ocular centrism, on the denial of contact. And I think with this case, the anthropology of images finds, in that case of judicial images, a fertile ground for examining image manipulation right down to the techniques that seek to deploy the power of bewitchment. So it leads us back to David Friedberg, the power of images. But what I meant, this is a very controversial topic, because I think the only way you can address effectively the power of images is to say that there's a very precise visual protocol that you're able to build and to reflect upon. And that's all.
Scusami Manu, allora grazie infinite Valérie per questo viaggio molto interessante e confermo insomma il mio felice ritrovarmi così con studiosi che riescono a fare quello che talvolta mi pare noi storici dell'arte non siamo capaci di fare, e cioè stimolare una riflessione intorno alle immagini che esca un po' da quelle così tradizionali contorni di cui purtroppo ancora oggi la nostra disciplina talvolta soffre. Io ho tantissime domande per Valérie e naturalmente il dibattito può essere fatto in italiano, in francese, in inglese, ognuno può parlare la lingua che vuole, quindi sentitevi liberi di esprimervi come meglio credete, per cui prima eventualmente di fare qualche domanda a Valérie, io lascerei la parola al pubblico per domande, anche commenti, riflessioni su quello che abbiamo ascoltato. Grazie. Sì, è là, il microfono, aspettiamo che qualcuno alzi la mano. Nessuno? Prego. Aspetta Margherita perché abbiamo bisogno del microfono.
Ah, ok. Ma è mai stato trovato una maniglia? Cioè qualcosa per reggere queste tavolette?
Sì, abbiamo trovato molti esempi da queste manolette, si chiamano handle,
sì.
ma dopo perché questo periodo no, ecco il problema, ma siamo sicuri che funzionava come tavolette, ma non abbiamo ritrovato il pezzo mancante. Ma conosco esempio sì, più tardi di questo. Quindi.
Io avrei una domanda sullo spazio dove si svolgevano queste esecuzioni capitali, e in particolare il patibolo come dispositivo. Era sempre un palco costruito su una piazza o abbiamo anche altri spazi nei palazzi pubblici utilizzati per queste esecuzioni capitali?
Sì, è molto importante la sua domanda, grazie, perché avevo una parte che non ho sviluppata sulla locus calguarie, perché maybe I switch to English, sorry, because it comes in English. The first thing to say is that it was out extramuros, and the scaffolding place was set outside the city. That's normal. And but what was really interesting is this the spatial dimension is that they had to perform the amende honorable and ask for forgiveness in the whole city. So there was a whole procession to go there, and they would kneel in specific places. And for instance, if we compare that to rituals that happened in Germany, this is going to be very gruesome. I'm sorry, I apologize for, because when you think about it, it's terrible. To accelerate the punishment theater, they designed in Germany crosses where not only one porphyr could go along and made his amende honorable, but two, because they were bas-relief on two parts. So the way you can understand that is they wanted to execute more at the same time. And that's quite frightening. But we know that the procession in Germany to the scaffolding was designed in a way that it would perform a ritual, and also it would be it would be linked to the locus calvaria, which means the place of the Calvary. Because if you think of in Aramaic or in Hebrew what means Golgotha or Gugolette, it means it means the mount of the skull, the crane, and it was a sort of little mountain where the execution would happen, because obviously it had an advantage from the theater of the vision, and how do you maybe is that okay? Is it okay?
Sì, ma mi chiedevo se questo dispositivo era comune in tutte le città, cioè uscire fuori le mura, o se in grandi città, e abbiamo anche il caso di Venezia, c'erano altri spazi urbani utilizzati.
Sì, è una domanda importante. For the Venice case, I suppose Valentina knows more, because there's this confraternity of San Giovanni de Collato, and I suppose to reconstruct each of the specific cases, how it was performed, you would need to be very specific about also who would attend, because obviously some of the most important people of city, the magistrate wouldn't necessarily like to attend those funerals. They were very ambivalent at the time too. So in some instances, you can sort of say more about who was there, where was it performed exactly. But I wouldn't be able to generalize. And as for those, we know that they are probably from. It's really hard from the stylistic analysis can't really help where they use in northern Italy for sure, Lombardia for sure, but we don't know much more. So if you have any ideas, but this is something that has to be, and also of the remaining wooden panels that we know were used as tavolette, there are maybe not more than 30, 32. Until the 16th century, so it's really not a lot. And the last thing I should add is they were sometimes preserved in specific altars, and that's why we know more about the handle and the specific, if they were used as twofold, or because they were also altars specifically designed to host those tavolette when they were not in use. But I'm sure that Valentina knows more about that.
Il caso di Venezia penso sia abbastanza noto a tutti noi che ci occupiamo appunto di questo contesto. Al contrario, la pena capitale si effettuava nello spazio urbano, assolutamente urbano, e perfino la processione era una spettacolarizzazione dello spazio urbano. Quindi credo che i casi siano diversi, però mi chiedo anche, questa è una riflessione che forse dovremmo fare allargando lo sguardo ad altri contesti, se questa caratteristica dell'esecuzione extra spazio urbano non sia più tipica del tardo medioevo, primo Rinascimento, e se poi invece appunto da un punto di vista performativo non fosse più efficace che la condanna in qualità di momento esemplare, chiaramente fosse addirittura reinserita nello spazio urbano proprio a questo scopo. Mi viene così da farmi la domanda. A Venezia addirittura abbiamo il caso assurdo per cui i condannati a morte sono perfino sepolti negli stessi cimiteri di chi condannato a morte non era, anche se in uno spazio che era loro riservato. Quindi non c'è neanche l'esclusione dallo spazio cimiteriale.
First of all, thank you for the beautiful presentation. And I wanted to ask, in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, was it always the execution by means of beheading, or also by hanging? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's obviously very important question. So there's a very long answer to that, because you will, but in the Middle Ages until, well, very late actually, beheading was kind of a privilege for noblemen. So you would be beheaded. That was conceived as something less infamous than being hanged. Hanged would be, depending, but in those cases, no, you find the beheading it is also linked to the crime, obviously. So there's a proportion between being beheaded would also correspond to a specific penalty. So there's two gradients, two parameters you have to. So in the cases I've analyzed, that was simply in that case, because you saw that's a very sophisticated ritual. This wouldn't be only for, it could happen to any criminal, but it was chosen also because of the spectacle of the ritual condemnation and the way, performing that kind of ritual would be more effective in the minds of those considered.
Also, I suppose that when the person was hanged, the tavolette weren't shown. So
yeah, it only tavolette are shown only when execution is performed in that way.
Grazie Valérie. Mi chiedevo, la Chiesa riformata ha una alternativa alla forza dell'immagine?
La Chiesa riformata, the Reformation, maybe I can answer in English. Thank you. Yeah, the first thing would be that if you read Calvin, especially, he would just say that this is only this can't work, this is magic, bewitchment, this is bad, this is not something you want. So the belief in the ritual of the efficacy of the image, this is something that is very controversial for reformers. They would just discard it as something not only non-effective, but something that is completely heretic and that has nothing to. But it's really interesting. I haven't found any, for the moment, I haven't found any specific. If I think of other reformers, Zwingli or dealing with these questions, because they would also add that kissing the crucifix is just idolatry, and so that would be the main sort of discourse. But have they really discussed the specific use of tavolette? I can't find any example. The only really interesting example of distrust I've been able to trace is Montaigne, obviously. That is very intrigued, and when he completely understands, he really genuinely thinks it's a sleight of hand. It's some kind of a trick that is.
Io ero più, intanto grazie, fantastico, ero più interessata a una questione legata alle fonti che usi, quindi proprio per capire il tipo di uso delle tavolette e anche tutti questi dettagli molto precisi su come venivano appunto disposte, quando, per quanto tempo, cioè tutti questi dettagli, in che tipo di fonti si riescono a trovare, cioè lì in una delle slide avevi menzionato un manuale, però magari forse puoi dire qualcosa di più su proprio il tipo di fonti che ti aiutano a appunto individuare queste, appunto la procedura, ecco, l'uso.
Molto importante. So the main sources would be first, Conforto's manuals. So we have quite many that have been edited, translated into English by Nicolas Tapstra and others. And if I compare these practices with other practices in Germany, in Switzerland, mainly, in northern Germany, you'd have to find that in practical courses like the Damhuder, all the illustrated compendii of practical cases, criminal cases. So sometimes you find that kind of images, and it's very specific when you have maybe some drawings. That also happens. And in later periods, you don't necessarily have visual sources, but you have the tables of attendance, who was there, who paid. So that's very important also, and who, and you have to obviously to try to rebuild some kind of continuum between all those sources to understand if it was a practice that was somehow, that you would not necessarily back because it's ghastly, it's gruesome, and you don't want to, it's maybe something you want to get rid of, because there's this piety that is kind of, this visual piety that is very ambivalent. So you find instances in later periods where people are very much against that, because their rationale would be, if you're a real Christian, how can you possibly allow that? So they see the double, the ambivalence of this ritual, which is, and every time I show this picture, or I ask, legal historians about it, they are very struck about that, this aspect of the technology of pure death and the way you obtain what you want, whatever it takes.